Hello and welcome to SAF Insights. In this podcast series, we'll be uncovering the market forces behind sustainable aviation fuel, also known as SAF. In this episode, I'll be chatting to Dr. Helge Sachs, the Senior Vice President at EcoFT, which is a company owned by Sasol. It's a company that focuses on the synthetic production of SAF using renewable energy and hydrogen as feedstocks for the Fischer-Tropsch process. We'll be discussing how this type of synthetic SAF is produced, where and at what capacity, and the disadvantages and advantages of this type of SAF production pathway. This podcast, SAF Insights, is brought to you by Argus Media, which, as many of you know, is a leading independent provider of energy and commodity pricing information. My name is Bea O'Kelly, and I'm the European SAF reporter here at Argus. Hi, Helge. Thanks so much for your time today. Would you like to quickly introduce yourself before we get started on the questions?
Yeah, thank you, Bea. It's a great pleasure to be here. My name is Helge Sachs, and I'm heading Sasol EcoFT, which is a new company within Sasol that was announced to the market in September last year. And we are producing green fuels and green chemicals, and our market interest in our is very much focusing on SAF, sustainable aviation fuels.
Brilliant. So if we start with the basics then, so how does the process that you use, the Fischer-Tropsch process, work in the SAF production process, and what feedstocks are mainly used?
Yeah, that's a great question. So Fischer-Tropsch, these were two German chemical engineers and scientists that around 100 years ago in Germany, they filed a couple of patents around this process named after the two, Fischer-Tropsch, and the company Sasol has started out more than 70 years ago in using this knowledge to produce synthetic fuels from coal, so-called coal-to-liquids that they then also developed to leverage natural gas as a feedstock, which is why we call this process to be agnostic to the different feedstocks. So it is more or less universally applicable, and it can now also be used for renewable fuels, leveraging different other feedstocks. So what are the feedstocks that we use for most ideally sustainable ones for the carbon source, biomass, for example, or for example, municipal solid waste can be used. And then you would have to apply a so-called gasifier to gasify those feedstocks and to finally get the carbon monoxide, which is then combined with hydrogen that ideally comes from an electrolysis with renewable electricity, hydropower, or wind and sun. And with the hydrogen, the green hydrogen molecule, it can be combined in a Fischer-Tropsch reactor. In this synthesis process, you produce via the syngas, the hydrocracking process is then applied, and then you can produce different sorts of hydrocarbon chains in different fractions. So either jet fuel, for example, SAF, or diesel, naphtha, or other chemicals. But instead of the biomass or municipal solid waste for the gasification process, we can also use other CO2 sources, for example, industrial CO2 from point emitters, biogenic CO2 from, for example, water, waste and treatment units, or ultimately direct air capture to capture and sequester the carbon molecule directly from the atmosphere, and then use our reverse water gas shift technology that comes from our technology partner, Power-to-Liquid SAF, to produce the carbon monoxide. But at the end of the day, the combination of the carbon monoxide and the hydrogen molecule to produce syngas in a Fischer-Tropsch reactor is where the magic happens, to say, and where Sasol in the last 70 years mastered the technology to the extent that we are able, with our so-called slurry bed, low temperature Fischer-Tropsch technology, to really bring this to scale.
Yeah, it's really interesting that hydrogen can be used in this way in the SAF space. You know, we always hear about the hydrogen planes that are so far away from actually being usable and produced. But this is a way that hydrogen can really help the sustainable aviation space, and it's not too far away. I mean, you've announced that, production could start from 2026. Do you want to go into more detail about the EcoFT's production plans, capacity growth, and which sort of regions you focus on, which regions you'll be producing from?
Yeah, absolutely. And to your point about using hydrogen wisely, we also believe that using hydrogen, which is still only available in scarce volumes, to use it wisely for SAF as a drop-in fuel and use it for the existing installed base and assets that we fly with through the air. So connecting people via from continent to continent will work predominantly in the decades to come, particularly on large distances across oceans with the current technologies of jet turbines, which is why we clearly promote the uptake of sustainable aviation fuels. And how this can be done, and also on the timeline, the technologies are readily available already today. So electrolysis can be used, and as well reverse water gas shift, and we're currently also de-risking an electrified version of our reverse water gas shift technology together with topsoil gasification as well is readily available. However, there still needs to be some work to be done and also to be demonstrated that this can be done at large scale using the different feedstocks, biomass and municipal solid waste. However, we are predicting an uptake of sustainable aviation fuels in the time corridor of 2026 onward. We are currently building semi-industrial scale demonstration units, and at the same time we are preparing in the different, the European Union as well as in the United States, some joint ventures with different partners where we are currently preparing industry scale plants, and the uptake of SAF will be somewhere around 27 plus. So that's why we are readily preparing now the market entry for these PTL or biomass power-to-liquid plants.
Yeah, that's great to know. Thank you. I mean, I know in Germany there's a lot of interest in this synthetic type of SAF, and there's already production there. I mean, it's getting a lot of attention now. I mean, how does this type of sort of power-to-liquid synthetic SAF actually compare with HEFA SAF? I mean, HEFA SAF, for our listeners who aren't sure, that's the most popular SAF production pathway in Europe at the moment. It's the most popular. It's the most it's got the largest production. There's one very large supplier. But what are the sort of advantages, disadvantages, comparing synthetic power-to-liquid SAF with that HEFA process? How will the cost compare? Once the synthetic SAF is starting to be produced, 2026, 2027 onwards, what will the comparisons be to HEFA?
Yeah, no, HEFA is absolutely the technology that's readily available from different suppliers. Companies like Neste have been successfully early on also started out to secure the different feedstocks, and they're absolutely well positioned to process these different feedstocks. There are multiple feedstocks that can be leveraged to produce HEFA, so from vegetable oils and used cooking oils and canola oils and animal fats and tallow, and more than these, and soybean oils. These can all be collected, and that's why the HEFA pathway is certainly a very promising one. In terms of the carbon intensity and the reduction potentials, if you're looking at the life cycle analysis of the greenhouse gas reduction potential of HEFA, it's somewhere in between 73 to 84%, as to our knowledge, whereas the PTL route has the potential to reduce the carbon intensity to up to almost 100%, 99%. And that's why this is certainly a very promising element in the PTL arena. However, if it comes to which technology will be scalable in the years to come, the HEFA pathway will certainly remain the most promising one in the near-term future, whereas the PTL pathway will be very promising in decades to come, in the 2030s plus. However, if you're looking at the maximum amount of SAF that can be contributed via the HEFA pathway, we're seeing a certain ceiling, possibly up to 20 million tons only until 2050. And when you're comparing the 20 million tons to the maximum demand in the market, the aviation industry will be consuming around 500 million tons of jet fuel by 2050, with all the planes that are already ordered and with the demand in the market, which is why it's a very promising pathway, and that's why we also believe it will be necessary to be technology open, to also promote any sort of technology and pathway that will contribute to the uptake of SAF, just like methanol to jet, alcohol to jet, gasification of different feedstocks, as mentioned before, from biomass to municipal solid waste, but also the classical power-to-liquid one. All the different pathways will contribute here.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned that ceiling, because as popular as HEFA is, it's the same feedstocks, isn't it? Well, it creates a renewable diesel called HVO, and there's demand from the diesel market as well. So there's limited feedstocks there. So it's very interesting. I mean, according to our data, we sort of see, based on publicly announced projects, around 21 million tons of SAF will be available globally by 2028. Around 17 million tons of those will be produced through HEFA or co-processing. At the same time, we see growing attention on synthetic fuels, as they can be produced using sort of highly competitive renewable biogenic feedstocks and promote higher emission savings, as you said. In this context, what do you think the market needs to boost synthetic fuels capacity, synthetic fuels production? How do you see the market developing in various regions? We know in the EU there's a sub-target. The EU SAF mandate has a sub-target for synthetic SAF, which will hopefully boost demand and boost supply. But what about in other regions such as the US?
Yeah, that's a great question. And maybe also to tying into the question before, because the one apparently conditions the other, namely what are the prices of the different pathways. So the major advantage of the HEFA pathway is that you can relatively quickly, with low capex requirements, you're able to repurpose an existing refinery. Amongst others, you can attach different technologies. Very successful is our technology partner, D Helge Sachs, with its Hydroflex technology here. So that's why it's relatively easily done, to say. That's why the cost of the product is also comparably low. Whereas PTL will, for some time, still be more expensive, simply due to the fact of the cost of the renewable electricity that's needed for the electrolysis part to produce green hydrogen there. But however, it now coming to the second part of your question, how to promote the uptake of the different pathways with this HEFA pathway for the decade to come to be still the dominating pathway. It will only work to have via encouraging certain sub-blending mandates, as done in the European Union already, where you have, for example, until 2030, an uptake of 6% SAF and a certain sub-quota that's specifically dedicated to the uptake of PTL SAF. And that's why this is certainly one lever to encourage also the production of wind and solar renewables in the European Union. But in other geographies, like in the United States or in Canada, for example, where you have large endowments of hydropower that can also be leveraged to produce PTL. That will also certainly be a quite interesting geography where PTL will, in the mid to long term, be one of the succeeding technologies. So that's why the regulatory framework with the different incentive schemes, where the European Union has rather decided to encourage a stick approach, whilst the United States with their grand SAF challenge, and the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, have opted for a carrot approach with tax incentives. So both incentive schemes seem to work from our calculations, which is why we're also strategically looking into the different geographies here. But it's very promising to see also throughout the midterm elections in the United States that irrespective of the political orientation in the United States, as we all know, climate change doesn't have any passport or political orientation. It will be necessary to have reliable and certain incentive schemes and regulatory frameworks in place. Otherwise, it will be very difficult for industrial players to really place strategic bets in the different geographies. So to have bankable business cases for all those opportunities will be absolutely necessary. And that's why regulatory frameworks that are reliable are of essence.
Absolutely. And that's a great note to end on, I think. Thanks so much for your time, Helge. It's really informative discussion there. And it's certainly an exciting time for the synthetic SAF market. And hopefully demand will just keep growing, and as will supply. If you enjoyed this podcast, please be sure to tune in for other episodes in our series, SAF Insights. And for more information on Argus's global coverage of the sustainable aviation fuel market, please visit argusmedia.com/SAF.
Thanks, Bea. Thanks for having me.